It's been a long couple of months, especially if you're in my truck. First, why am I blending soup? Well, I had corrective jaw surgery a few weeks ago, and I was mostly nonverbal until now, so I couldn't film anything new or do any voiceover stuff. Doubling down on that, I've spent way more time remodeling my bathroom than I have in the garage. Here's how it was when we first moved in April, thanks to the previous owner, and it sat like that until I realized I had about 6 weeks until my family was visiting and would prefer not to share the only functioning bathroom. I learned that 6 weeks is not enough time, nor do they think it counts if there's technically a hole in the floor you can pee into. Here's how it sits today. The truck fell victim to me violently switching to this project after getting halfway through that one. I've heard they make medication for that, but anyway, doesn't it look nice? Just look at all those holes you can pee into. Going into this, I thought I had everything pretty well figured out. Just change the fluids and we're ready to roll, right? Well, that to-do list is more or less still waiting for me to start it because I ended up getting lost in engine timing, stuck valves, broken bolts. The inside of the engine was basically glue, so I did a lot of cleaning and scrubbing and more cleaning and scrubbing. I changed the oil where I discovered that the plastic drain plug washer hadn't been replaced since the engine was painted, and that had to be decades ago. Is this drain plug washer older than I am? I also diligently did a lot of little things like get a fuel fill cap with an actual gasket. Cool. I drained the coolant, I cleaned some parts up there, which led to this moment of embarrassment when the coolant tubing blew up in my driveway and shot steam everywhere. No video of the steam explosion, but yeah, my neighbors definitely judge me. After that, it would run fine until it suddenly wouldn't, luckily dying twice in my driveway after returning home. Basically, it would flood the engine with fuel and die, like you could literally hear fuel flowing nonstop like a hose. It was wild. Why was that happening? Who even knows how a carb works? How could a loving God be so cruel? Well, I have a hunch, so let's strip down the carb. So my hunch is that there's something wrong with the float. A carb float is basically a toilet handle. It floats on the fuel inside of the carb and shuts off the fuel flow to the carb if the level gets high, but as the engine consumes fuel, the fuel level lowers, which opens the fuel flow and refills the carburetor. There's a lot of complicated engineering that goes into exactly how these work, but just think of it like a toilet float. Yeah, it's not supposed to make that noise. That means there's fuel inside of it, which means it's not a float anymore, it's a sink. And if it sinks, it's no longer reading the real fuel level in the carb, and it accidentally gushes fuel into the engine and kills it, thinking it's low on fuel, literally flooding the engine with fuel. This would also explain why there was a brief period where I was confused why I was getting like literally 4 miles a gallon. So, mystery solved. Carb floats are cheap, and I ordered one as soon as I found this, but you better believe I'm going to take any opportunity I have to light some fuel on fire. This is known as a controlled engineering burn, and it's the only way we can safely dispose of this fuel. It also has the plus of telling me exactly where the pinhole is, and so in theory I can just solder where the steam is escaping, and that should make it watertight again. I'll save you all the joy of watching me try to solder this by telling you that this just didn't work at all. Every time I soldered a pinhole, a new one opened up.
Wow, that looks great.
I thought about using some sort of fuel-safe epoxy, but then remembered that I had an $8 replacement part that was going to be ready the next morning, so we just called it a night. Spark plug wires are an easy but important fix. Here we're comparing the nice shiny new blue ones to these old ones, which fully escape my ability to explain how spark plug wires work. I have nothing. These should not work. There is no plug on the end. The more frustrated I get, the worse of a videographer I am, but I replaced the intake manifold gasket twice because I broke the final bolt clean off the first time, so that fixed that big oil leak that we had. I adjusted the carbs, I replaced the distributor. Biggest gains came from timing the engine, which was both the most educational part and also the most boring to rewatch. This engine is entirely manual, so I basically hang myself over the engine like this to crank it by hand to a known position, and then I tune the part that spins to create the spark manually. It was running a lot better, but it was still running rough. So the popping and the flames coming out of the intake is called a backfire, and that means that not all of the fuel is being burned and the engine accidentally shoots it back out the intake. Unfortunately, that means something is wrong with the valves or the camshaft. It's serious. Yeah. I do have a borescope, so we can take all the spark plugs out and look at what's happening inside each one of the cylinders to figure out if something is stuck or burned or broken. So pretty much every car uses a 4-stroke engine cycle, which means for every 2 rotations of the engine, each piston is moving up and down 2 times. That's 4 individual strokes. Each piston has 2 valves, an intake and an exhaust in this engine, and as the piston moves down, it opens up the intake valve and pulls air-fuel mixture into the cylinder. It pushes up on that to compress it, and it ignites it, which creates the power stroke, which pushes the piston back down. While the piston is moving back up, it opens the exhaust valve and pushes all of the exhaust gases out, and that happens in each of the 8 cylinders like thousands of times a minute. That's what the RPM means on your tachometer. So I have this set up here, and for every cylinder, I'm going to turn the crank 2 times to see what's happening with the intake and exhaust valves, and of course, each cylinder has a different orientation of the exhaust and intake valve, so I have my handy map drawn on an old cardboard box here. So this is one of the better cylinders, never mind how extremely dirty that piston is, but you can see as it's moving up and down, each of those valves at the top is opening and closing. Especially notice how big they're opening and closing. So this is one of the bad ones, and amazingly it's even dirtier. No surprise there, but you can see that only one of the valves is opening and the other seems to be stuck pretty shut. That could definitely cause our backfiring issue. So this is the valve stem, the part that actuates the valve itself. We're going to try to spray some penetrating oil directly on that seal, and nice. The internet says you can try to use mallets and other force to try to break it loose, but if you look at this video of an after of one of the bad valves, I have no idea why it's black like that, don't ask me why it's black. You can see that it's kind of opening a little bit, so we made progress. If the engine runs, it might be worth just driving it for a while to see if it kind of breaks itself loose. Maybe it just sat for too long and everything got stuck together. Again, don't ask me why that one is black. So, it's running better. There's a pretty low bar, but it's definitely running better. But besides the bad fuel mileage, the backfiring, the stalling, the leaking, the smoking, there's something seriously wrong with my truck. And there were plenty of hints looking back. First of all, the engine is blue, and all Chevy engines were orange until like the mid-70s. My new spark plugs didn't fit, so I had to go match them to the ones I pulled out of the engine, which should not have fit. I was replacing so many parts that at some point I realized I needed to figure out exactly what engine was in it. And that's when I discovered that contrary to how it was sold to me and how I brazenly advertised to you, is that this is not a 350. I can count 8 cylinders, so maybe it's a 305. Literally, the only cool thing about 305s is their metric name is 5.0. But the 70s and 80s were a dark time for domestic engines, and these blocks are underpowered and extremely undesirable, and it doesn't help that this one isn't in great shape. So pretty much every part on these old Chevy engines has a stamped number on it that you can look up on online decoders and it'll tell you exactly what you have. You should definitely do this before you buy an engine. The most common one people talk about is the block ID, which is a 6-digit number stamped on the driver's side of the block by the bell housing. But since they use the same block ID for like totally different engines across totally different decades, I much prefer the engine ID, which is on the front of the engine, usually behind the accessories of the alternator. This is an alphanumeric number that tells you where the engine was made, even the day it was made, and you can usually tie it down to a very specific engine. Did you write all those down? No, I'm just kidding, I wrote them down. So when we look at our decoder ring for the block number, we can see that it's either a 1975 262, which is a 6-cylinder, or a 1976 to 1985 305. Remember, my truck is a 1969. So just looking at this list, I don't really care about either of these engines, and we don't have to really look at any of the other numbers on it. I definitely don't care about the head IDs now, so we can skip that one, but let's look at the engine ID to see what we can learn. So the T tells us it was made in Tonawanda, New York, 1007, means its birthday is October 7th, and CPC, if you look up that code, tells you that it is a 1976 305. Remember, the block ID said it could either be a 6-cylinder or an 8-cylinder, so that's not very helpful. The engine VIN tells us all the information we want to know, including that it's estimated it peaks at 145 horsepower. So, yeah, we don't really like this. The first option is rebuild the 305 that it has in it right now. I could also buy a tired small block or big block to rebuild as kind of a fun side project. I could also buy a remanufactured engine online where they've done all that work for you, or I could LS swap it. The pros for rebuilding the 305 are that I could start right now. That's pretty much the only pro. On the other hand, we're going to be putting a lot of time and money into an engine that will be pretty worthless, undesirable, low performing, and not period correct at the end of it, so it doesn't really feel like a good option. And while it seems strange to rebuild another old engine instead of the 305, the nice thing is that any of these engines are the same cost and work as rebuilding the 305, but you end up with something with better resale value that's more capable and a heck of a lot cooler. The cons of that are I really don't look forward to interacting with people on Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist who know what they have and are trying to sell their engines for thousands of dollars more than they're worth. I could also get burned again, but now I know where all those numbers live, so hopefully I don't. I also have the problem of what I do with the 305 once I buy another engine. And at the end of the day, a rebuilt old engine is still not going to be like modern. I'm not going to be able to take it out in cold weather, but luckily, we don't have that problem in Southern California, so. One of the best things about a remanufactured engine is, first of all, they do all the work for you, but it also comes with a warranty. It's been hot tanked and probed, which means you know that it's a quality engine, and it'll ship to me for like $500. The cons, I don't know if you guys have caught on, but I try to do things as cheaply, as efficiently as I can, and this is a lot more expensive than rebuilding it myself. It also has questionable origins, like I won't be able to inspect the engine to know what block I'm getting. They basically just take people's core returns and rebuild them and then sell them. I don't really know how to feel about that. On top of that, because I have a 305 but don't want to buy a 305, I would pay for a core deposit waiver, which is like $400. Shipping is like $400 or $500, and that's about as much as 2 rebuild-ready engines, so you can almost think about it like I'd get 2 shots at doing it myself just for the logistics costs. So obviously I have to include an LS swap as an option. It's a modern engine, big power. I would also be getting better than like 9 miles a gallon. It would have good resale value and it'd be cool. It's also kind of cool to have a modern engine have absolutely zero emissions control and just bypass that whole California experience. But on the other hand, I did say in my first video that I was not going to do this. This engine would definitely not be period correct, which is like the only thing my truck has going for it. And putting in the LS also means you have to upgrade the ignition, the fuel systems, sensors, mounts, exhaust, basically everything. It's a lot of work, and it would start out cheap if I got like a wrecked car, but it would add up pretty quick. So actually the rows of this table are ordered by ascending cost. And while I'm very cost conscious, I'm also value conscious. Basically, if I'm going to throw money at an engine rebuild, I might as well pay to rebuild a desirable engine instead of pumping money into an engine that will still be worthless. I think. I can't decide. Time to go work on the bathroom some more, maybe. Side note, I saw a meme recently about getting yourself a girl who can fit inside the engine bay to help you work on your truck, and I am proudly that girl. My girlfriend does not seem to appreciate it.